Hello and welcome to a special presentation from In the Money Media. PTF and Nick Tammaro here to do a way too early Kentucky Derby morning line prediction. And Nick, let's bring you in straight away with a question to talk to us about what the job of the morning line maker is. Let's start right there.
Yeah, so the morning line maker, which Mike Battaglia will make the Kentucky Derby morning line. He's been doing it for years, and Mike's an esteemed morning line maker, former announcer. And what his job is to do is the unenviable task of predicting how the public is going to bet the Kentucky Derby. Obviously, it is a much more difficult race than really any race run on the calendar in terms of working the line so that you get it to a manageable amount of points. And what I mean by that is that every price that you give a horse has an associated point value that's determined with the formula that you plug in for it, which the formula in this case is that number minus 1 divided by 100. And so doing that, you want to hold yourself to a point total around the 125 point mark. And I've put together a line at 126.7. And so what you're trying to do in doing that is predicting how the public is going to bet the race. Now, the difficulty of it is that generally you're confined to a certain set of odds. And what I mean by that is you're not going to make anybody above 50 to 1. You're going to try and make as few horses as possible, 50 to 1, in fact, because regardless of what their respective chances are, these horses did earn qualification to the Kentucky Derby. So they have some quality to them. So you want to be careful about making them too big a price. But inevitably in a race like this with that many horses, you're going to have some at that number because there's just no alternative.
So just to underline how you're describing that, this is not a line that anybody's taking any bets on. This is a line somebody hired by the track is trying to make to give the public a guide of how the public is going to bet. And baked into that are certain suppositions. Well, for one thing, unlike if you were just a bettor trying to make money on the Kentucky Derby and you wanted to make your own line, you're going to want to make that line to 100 points, covering 100% of the outcomes. Why is it different in the morning line? Well, it's different because of the track takeout. For one thing, because of the track takeout, that math isn't going to add up to 100%. It's going to add up to 100% plus the takeout. Thus, you get to that number. And you mentioned the idea of you're not going to want to make any horses too short for a morning line. You're not going to want to make horses too long because, again, I mean, there's a little bit of a marketing element here. You don't want to insult any owner by saying your horse is 100 to 1. And you also don't want to make the race, and this doesn't come up so much in the Derby, but just generally speaking, make the race seem like it's uncompetitive by having there be too big of a favorite in this spot. Did I do a decent job explaining that?
100%. You got it exactly right. Yep. You want to remain respectful. I don't think I'm giving away any kind of state secret in saying that when I made the Breeders' Cup morning line in 2022, it was made very clear to me, nobody above 30. So you didn't want to insult any of them. And quite honestly, I don't really know how many horses I would have made above 30. But you don't want to lead anybody to believe that. By the way, that's not the only time I've gotten that directive. Right. So it happens, right? You want to make your line as accurate as possible. I'm somebody that doesn't push it to the 130, 135 mark. That will allow you to look a little bit more accurate. But really, what you're doing is you're spreading the money out too much because we're looking at 100 plus takeouts. So really we're in, you're supposed to be in the 120 to 125 range. 126.7 is what I put together for the Derby. And that's about the top end of it.
Let's take a look at what you came up with here through this Excel spreadsheet. Is this the tool that you typically use, Excel, to put together your lines that you do when you make the morning line for a track like Keeneland?
Yeah, I use a Google Docs or a Google Sheet. So basically the same thing. And then I have the formulas plugged into the right. You put in the number, the odds, and then the formula automatically calculates. I will admit that in doing this, I did kind of take a look at some of the work that David Aragona had put together on DRF, just because David's an outstanding morning line maker and obviously has a great opinion. The only real difference between my line and his line was that I did make Forever Young a little bit higher. I don't know if I don't know exactly the way to put it. I don't know if there might be a little Japanese fatigue after Derma Sotogake ran poorly last year. Forever Young is a horse that's also probably not as embraceable as Derma Sotogake. I also think that this is a Derby with two much clearer favorites. So, I mean, obviously our conversation starts with them. I have Fierceness at 3. I'm not going to be surprised if Mike Battaglia ultimately moves this horse down to 5-2. I do know, kind of knowing what Mike has done a little bit in the past, I think he's going to make Sierra Leone pretty short as well. He has had a tendency of making the Kentucky-based horses a little bit shorter price-wise. from a buyer speed figure standpoint, which historically those are the biggest indicator of how races are going to get bet. It's really no contest. Fierceness is a much, much faster horse on buyer speed figure. So you would expect his price to be significantly lower than Sierra Leone. I think it's just that Sierra Leone has gotten to be so immensely popular. He has a running style that really a lot of the public finds very intriguing. And I think that's going to lead to him getting a pretty significant amount of support. So I have them at 3 and 4. I feel like Catching Freedom, who has kind of really attractive connections. He has an upward pattern. He won a race very impressively in the Louisiana Derby. I think his running style is, while not necessarily ideal for a race like the Derby, he feels like a horse that's going to get a lot of support. And Brad Cox's runners in general do get a lot of it. So I had him at 8, and those were the only 3 horses that I made a single digit.
Were you surprised, as I'm sure you noticed while doing a little research for this, that in England right now, there are multiple books that actually have Sierra Leone as the clear favorite? I'm taking your point. Normally, in a normal line, buyers have primacy in terms of the public bets. I've been on record as saying if the Kentucky Derby were just a race on a Thursday at Aqueduct and there was the speed figure difference between Fierceness and Sierra Leone, Fierceness would be like an even money shot practically, just given how many lengths faster he is on paper. But the narratives come into play in the Kentucky Derby, and there's so many narratives about Fierceness needing to have things his own way and the in and out pattern and all this. I think you've got it right here. This is what I would have done. But I mean, I think there are people out there, and I'm not going to fall out of my chair even if Sierra Leone ends up being favored over Fierceness based on what I've seen in the international market. Did you even give that half a thought?
Half a thought, yeah. Yeah, I did. Knowing that you had told me that and being familiar with that right now, I think there's a little bit of recency bias to that. I think there's always a reaction immediately after the race is run. And I remember you and I speaking on the Monday after the Bluegrass about Sierra Leone being favored in some of the international books. And I thought to myself, I think as people sit down and actually start looking at the PPs and realize how good Fierceness looks on paper, I think he'll ultimately end up going off favored. Reminds me a little bit of the Zandon Epicenter conversation from a few years ago when a lot of the chatter before the Derby was that Zandon was going to be the morning line favorite and that he might end up favored. And ultimately, I think that when people took a step back and they let themselves kind of think about the race a little bit more, they came to the conclusion that he could not be favored in there. And I think it's kind of the same conclusion with Sierra Leone. When you look at him, you look at his PPs against a horse like Fierceness's, you just can't really get to that number. So Epicenter and Zandon respectively ended up at 4 and 6, but you had other horses in there that took a lot of money. Taba went off 5-1. Messier went off 7-1. It's just that there's no third choice that's really supposed to soak up any type of money in here. And that's what will keep Fierceness and Sierra Leone as the 2 shortest prices by a real distance as far as Derby betting goes. Then we'll have that group of 3 or 4 horses in the 8 to 16-1 range. And I've tried to capture those horses, at least with Catching Freedom, just a touch. Resilience. Resilience is a horse who I can't really figure out how he's going to get bet either. I mean, his Wood Memorial figure looks slow, but otherwise he looks like a horse who's kind of coming up in terms of recent performance. And yeah, he beat a suspect field in the Wood, but he did it very impressively. I've not really taken a deep dive into the Thorograph sheets, but I should in order to get a sense of what some of those players might be looking at. He's obviously not going to be fast enough on those, but he's a horse that will at least offer some appeal.
Are there any other narratives that you took into account putting this together? One, I was guessing maybe you had Just Steel on the list where you did with thoughts that there'll be a lot of stories about Dwayne Lucas and this horse maybe cycling back into form under the Twin Spires. But I mean, I'm really hung up on that idea, that narrative, some of which we don't even know yet because they're going to have to do with how horses look when they get in the grounds, but that they affect this line more than many others. Is that something you took into consideration?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it feels like I've seen a lot of the quote unquote wise guys say that Just Steel is a horse that they could see themselves betting. So I didn't want to make him too big a price. And his last running line actually looks fine. It looks like one that people could bet a little bit off of. I've always been skeptical of this horse distance wise. And, you wonder a little bit about whether he can ultimately be a winning type. He's probably a horse that'll just fight it out and end up getting a piece of it. But he's going to at least take some money. There were other horses that have been popular throughout the spring that it was unclear exactly how the public is going to handle them, like Track Phantom. who, feels like he's a bit of a phantom in the sense that nobody's talking about him. And he was a horse that's been well backed in all of his prior starts in 2024. He's also going to be forwardly placed. He's in the hands of a trainer that's done very well in this race and hasn't won it, but has had horses run well, 2 second-place finishes, at least in the last 7 years or so. So, he was a horse who I thought I didn't want to be too flippant with regards to the horse that's going to ultimately, how much money he gets is going to determine where a lot of these horses land price-wise is Forever Young. So I don't know exactly what to make of him. I made him 12, could have made him 10. I feel like Just a Touch is a horse who's going to take money as well. I think there are some distance limitations, but he's still a horse that's only making his 4th career start. He ran a very, very strong race in the Bluegrass, so it's going to be no great surprise if he comes right back with another strong performance, and he's at least going to get a lot of support at the windows as well.
Those were the two I was going to ask you about as my next 2 questions, really, as we sort of go down the odds line. You've sort of already mentioned about Forever Young. And that for me is one where I feel like that could go. I mean, there's some world in which he goes there, he burns up the track, and he's 8-1. I can't really imagine him being any shorter than that. Or it could go the other way and be twice that. So I mean, I feel like I would have done what you did, just sort of hit it right in the middle here at 12. But I almost feel like it's one of those funny things where 12 might be the right morning line, even though like the right morning line guess at this point, though I kind of feel like the narrative is going to push it either down or up. And there's just really no way of knowing right now. So you split the difference. I mean, do you take my point on that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I know right now on Odds Checker, he's 8. So he'll probably end up being more of that. I think you could probably, on my line, maybe move Catching Freedom up, move Forever Young down, leave Just a Touch at 10, and you end up just reversing those two. It feels like I'm probably in the ballpark on everybody else. I mean, there are horses on this Odds Checker that I'm looking at right now. They're obviously not running, so it's a little tough to use those as a gauge. But yeah, I think, like I said, he's kind of the linchpin for how the rest of the race gets bet, because if he takes a bunch of money, you're going to have some horses drift up that otherwise, maybe we would have thought at one point they could be a shorter price.
My tip on using Odds Checker, because it's a compiler, and so it'll bring in any half-ass book that, who knows if you could even really get a bet down on, but they have a line, they'll pull that in. If you drill down one level to look at the actual books, there's one bookie in particular, and they don't pay us, so I'm not plugging them, but they're the one that appears first. They're generally the sharpest lines. And if anybody from that book wants to pay us, I'm easy man to find. So we're almost out of time here, Nick, but I want to each pull in one horse at a bit more of a price to talk about. And the one that I am hoping you are exactly right about in here, and I think you have a good chance to be right about the morning line guess, but I think is an interesting horse, is Honor Marie. Maybe not so much to win, but as a horse to be there in that in the top 3 or 4, and maybe be a horse I'd look to be keying some trifectas and superfectas bottom up from. I feel real good about this. I mean, I could see him taking a little wise guy support, but I can't see him being lower than 20. And boy, at 30 or higher, definitely a horse I'd be interested in. You feel real good about that 30-1 guess on him? And what do you think about him as a horse? The case basically being good closer, cycling into form, one that, we heard from Frank McGoey this winter was not fit for that first start back, might be ready for a peak effort in the 3rd race of the form cycle.
Yeah, I mean, he's got a look to him, no doubt. He's probably ends up, I think, in the 25-1 range. Probably deserves to be somewhere around there. So he was a horse that I think you probably could try to make 20 if possible. Could be circling into form, as you said, has run well locally. It feels like historically in this race, there's always been a certain amount of attention that the Kentucky Jockey Club alums get. And I think that's part of the reason why he could end up taking a little bit more money. So yeah, I wouldn't sleep on him at all.
Does have that potentially all-important race over the track. Churchill, this is narrative too, but there's some truth to it. Not a track every horse necessarily likes. Why don't you pull one of the long shots in just to yap about either one you struggled with making the line or one you'd be interested in betting at the price, something on that order?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you 2. They're both horses that are going to be making up ground, and I don't necessarily love going with, deep closing types, but Mystik Dan is a horse who I think was very dressed up off the Southwest. I feel like he's now a little dressed down I think his Arkansas Derby may have been better than people realized. I think he was taken out of his game a little bit. He really made the only meaningful off the pace move. I could see him running a much better race at Churchill. I think if it's a day, especially where being inside is not a problem, I could imagine Brian Hernandez Jr. trying to run the Calvin Burrell type of trip here. So he's one. I also think Domestic Product is a horse that's a little bit better than his PPs indicate. I think that Tampa Bay Derby fig is about 6 points low. And I think we're going to hear reports on him training relatively well. The other thing is that Irad is going to ride this horse, so he's not going to be 30 to 1. He'll end up being shorter than that. The problem is on form, he's 30 to 1. So you can't make him much shorter than that. But those are two horses I think that I could see myself using a little bit underneath, trying to slide into the number here. And, if they end up, it seems a little too chaotic for them to end up under a horse like Sierra Leone. So I could see myself kind of playing them a little bit more under just a touch and Fierceness and kind of trying to beat Sierra Leone on some of those tickets. But there are horses that I wouldn't be mind being alive to in maybe some of the backups in the multi-race bets and ultimately trying to just squeeze them in there for a piece of it.
I'm scrolling through one more time. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see what Nick hung on all of these horses. And just one last note before we get out of here, just another positive on Domestic Product. I did the show with Sean Borman earlier in the week, and the question I forgot to ask him was, what, he's so into how horses finish. And I was like, well, if he doesn't have a fast finishing speed out of that Tampa Bay race with the slow final time, you can toss him. Well, that was not the case. He said he came home, I think he said in around 100. We'll get to talk to Sean again and ask him that question to confirm. But I mean, it was a proper late pace number that he ran. And if you're saying you think the final was low anyway, all of a sudden he starts to get interesting, maybe more as a third and fourth. I think we're out of time here, Nick, but really appreciate your time today. Last thing, just for the viewers, or if you're listening, go over to YouTube and give us your comments on Nick's morning line. Nothing, no gratuitous shots, please. If you weren't right for a certain place with the letters, maybe put your comments somewhere else for this one. But for our loyal viewers and listeners on the In the Money Media Network, we'd love to hear from you. What did Nick get right? What did Nick get wrong? What do you think of my hat? Whatever you want to put in there. We'll keep the comments going, and Nick and I will both pop in there and have an opportunity to interact with you a little bit. We appreciate you, Nick, and we'll be talking soon.
Thanks, my friend. Talk to you soon.